All right, let's dive into something pretty fascinating today. We're going to be looking at how we even begin to figure out if someone's creative.
Yeah, this should be fun.
You sent over this paper, it really caught my eye.
Yeah.
Excerpts from, oh, it's a bit of an older one, a 1995 paper in Educational Psychology Review. The title is Assessment of Creativity: Resolving a Midlife Crisis.
Oh, yeah, by John C. Houts and Damon Krug.
Right, Houts and Krug. Resolving a Midlife Crisis, just the title itself.
That's a good one.
So we're going to do a deep dive into this paper, try to unpack some of the key ideas here, and give everyone listening, a clear sense of how the whole idea of measuring creativity has changed over time, what's going on now, and maybe even get a glimpse of where things are headed.
Yeah, absolutely. Trying to figure out how to assess creativity. It's been a challenge for a while.
Well, and even back then, right, in the mid-90s, I mean, they were already talking about a midlife crisis in creativity assessment. What even was that crisis? And what have we learned since then? I'm really curious to see what this paper has to say.
Yeah, for sure. And I think to understand where we are now, we really need to sort of unpack some of the basic terms.
Okay.
The paper really nicely lays out the differences between measurement, assessment, and evaluation.
Okay, yeah, because those terms get thrown around all the time, and I think sometimes interchangeably.
Right, exactly. So measurement at its core, it's all about putting numbers to things,
Hmm.
right? Like when you get a score on a test, that's measurement.
Okay, so it's quantifying it, putting a number to something, making it measurable.
Yeah, exactly. But then assessment that takes those numbers and you start comparing them. Is one score higher? How do these different performances kind of stack up?
So assessment is about sort of establishing a benchmark. Like, okay, this is where we stand relative
Right. Yeah,
to
exactly.
some standard or...
And then you've got evaluation.
Mhm.
And this is where we actually start to assign value to those scores. Is a high score good?
Right. Is this something we want?
Is a particular ranking desirable?
Yeah.
Exactly. And so the authors, they're really careful to say that what they're focusing on here is assessment, that process of comparing scores, and then how decision makers use that information.
Right, and that makes a lot of sense, especially thinking about education in particular, which this paper is focused on. And the paper sort of points out, there's this underlying assumption that we generally think creativity is a good thing,
Right, yeah.
which, I find that really interesting because they also sort of point out that how society feels about truly creative individuals can be a little complicated.
Yeah, it can be complicated. You celebrate creativity publicly, but fostering it, it's a whole other challenge sometimes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it can definitely be a mixed bag. But for now, we're really focusing in on that assessment part. How do we identify and try to even compare different levels of creative potential? Okay, so with those definitions kind of as our foundation, let's look at some of the traditional ways that people have thought about, trying to measure creativity. And the paper talks about looking at the product, the process, the person, and what they call the press, meaning the environment.
Yeah.
So this has been a really useful way to think about the different aspects of creativity that we want to measure. So first, we've got the product, right?
Yeah, so when we talk about measuring the product, we're really looking at the actual, results of the creative work, those tangible things.
Right. So what you actually produced, what came out of that creative process.
Scores on creativity tests, you know, how well someone solves puzzles, judges ratings of, I don't know, artistic creations, or even, something like winning awards.
Yeah, right. So like, let's say there's a design competition. The final designs would be the product.
Right, exactly.
Right. And those get evaluated on criteria like originality and how well they actually function.
Yeah, right, the functionality.
Okay. So then we have the process.
Yeah, so now the process. That gets more into how creative people actually go about their work.
It's not so much about the final outcome,
Right.
but how you got there.
Yeah, and that's where it often gets a little more qualitative. You might be interviewing artists or scientists, asking them, how do you work?
Right.
And anecdotal accounts, those stories you hear about creative individuals and how they do things and observations, those all kind of fall under process.
So you're looking at the steps involved, the thinking styles they use, the techniques they employ.
Exactly.
Okay, then we've got the person.
So measuring the person, that gets into the characteristics and traits of the individual.
Right.
And so this is where you might use personality questionnaires, surveys that ask about their past creative activities,
Okay.
self-report checklists. So they rate themselves. How creative do they think they are?
Right.
Or even peer nominations. Who do your peers think is most creative?
Oh, interesting. So, like in a work environment, you could ask everyone on the team, who do you think is the most innovative person here?
Right, exactly.
Okay, that's an interesting way to approach it. And then finally, we have the press.
The press, yeah.
Right.
And that really focuses on the impact of the environment on creativity.
Right, right, right.
So can we try to measure that creative workspace?
Yeah.
Is it supportive?
Yeah, what's the atmosphere like?
Is it encouraging? Is it really restrictive?
Right. So, a school, for example, that encourages kids to experiment and be willing to take risks that would probably have a different press score than one that's very rigid and rule bound.
Exactly. That environment, that context really influences the creativity of those students.
Right, yeah. Okay, so those are the four kind of main areas. And then the paper brings in Hosfer's taxonomy, which, I mean, is another way to organize these approaches. It's got things like divergent thinking tests, attitude and interest inventories, personality inventories, biographical measures, ratings, product judgments, self-reports of achievement, and even studying super creative people.
Yeah. Studying people who've done really impressive things
Right.
to try to understand their creativity.
Right. And I mean, it kind of underscores how many different ways researchers have tried to get a handle on creativity. Like, it's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot to grapple with.
The paper mentions that, Petrosco identified hundreds of creativity tests, and Hansley and Torrance found over 200 that focus on different abilities and traits. I mean, that's a huge number. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's really interesting. What really stands out, even from this historical perspective, is this constant push and pull between trying to measure something that's inherently individual
Yeah.
and different for everyone and wanting to standardize that measurement.
Okay.
And you can see that in all these tests popping up, each trying to capture a different piece of what it means to be creative.
Right, right, right.
Now, it might seem overwhelming at first,
A lot to take in.
all these tests, but there's some good things that have come out of this.
Mhm.
It's allowed us to look at creativity at different levels through different perspectives. There's flexibility depending on what we're trying to figure out. It's really helped to develop theories about creativity itself.
Mm.
And of course, it's let us apply these assessments in so many real-world situations.
Right. So instead of it being this confusing jumble of tests, it's more like people were exploring a lot of different avenues, trying to figure out, how do we even measure creativity?
Exactly. Yeah. It's like exploring a huge maze.
Okay, so now the paper goes on to talk about specific examples of some of these creativity tests, and I think it's helpful to actually look at a few to see what they're trying to do.
Yeah, definitely.
So let's start with I think probably one of the more well-known ones, the Torrance tests of creative thinking.
Oh yeah, the TTCT, that's a big one. It's really kind of a foundational assessment in this field.
Okay.
There are two main versions of the TTCT, verbal and nonverbal forms.
Okay.
The nonverbal ones, they're often called thinking creatively with pictures.
Okay.
Those are used a lot with younger kids.
Yeah.
And they're asked to do things like, take a basic shape and make a more complex drawing out of it. Or they have to complete lines to make a picture, or use the same shape over and over again in different drawings.
Oh, okay. So like a child could take a simple squiggle and turn it into a whole scene or something.
Exactly. And then you have the verbal forms, the thinking creatively with words part. And this involves things like asking questions about a situation, trying to figure out what might have caused something to happen, coming up with ways to improve an existing product, thinking of like unusual uses for everyday objects, or responding to what-if scenarios. So these tests are all about measuring divergent thinking, which is that ability to generate multiple and varied solutions.
Right. So it's not just about finding the one right answer like convergent thinking would be.
Right, exactly. So it's more like, brainstorm all the unusual ways you could use a brick.
Oh, I like that. That's a good example. Okay. And then the paper talks about how these tests get scored, and they look at things like fluency, flexibility, originality, and elaboration. Can you break those down a little?
Sure. So fluency is just the total number of relevant, meaningful responses someone comes up with.
Okay. So how many ideas they can generate?
Right. And then flexibility looks at the variety of categories or different types of responses they come up with. Originality is how unique those responses are compared to everyone else who took the test. And elaboration, that gets more into the nonverbal forms, like how much detail they put into the drawings. And then more recently, they've even added resistance to premature closure as a scoring category.
Oh, interesting. What's that?
It's that ability to keep an idea kind of open, explore different possibilities before jumping to a final solution, which might not be as creative.
Oh, okay. I see. So you don't want to shut down those possibilities too early in the process.
Exactly. You want to stay open.
Okay. And the paper points out that, while the TTCTD is designed to be a pretty relaxed, non-threatening testing environment, it does involve a good bit of writing.
It does, yeah.
And it mentions that there is evidence to support its validity and that it's used across cultures. But it also acknowledges that it's had its share of critical reviews.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Even a test that's really widely used and generally respected, it doesn't mean there aren't questions.
Right, right, right.
And some of those critiques have really gotten at the heart of things.
Yeah.
Does the TTCT really measure creativity as we understand it? Are the scores stable? Does it consistently measure what it's supposed to measure? And these are really fundamental questions when we're talking about assessing anything.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not a perfect measure, even though it's been around for a while.
Right.
Okay, so now the paper brings up the Wallach and Kogan tests. How are those different?
Yeah. So Wallach and Kogan,
Yeah?
they also have both verbal and nonverbal tasks.
Okay.
Verbal things like listing things in a category, alternative uses for objects,
Yeah.
Finding similarities between things that seem different, and then nonverbal stuff like interpreting patterns and line drawings.
Okay, so some similarities there.
Right, but they're mainly scored for fluency, how many responses you can come up with, and uniqueness. How original are those responses? And a key difference here is that there are no time limits for these tests, which is different from a lot of other creativity tests.
Oh, interesting.
And they've also tended to find a lower correlation with IQ scores compared to the TTCT.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and Wallach himself, he was really adamant that creativity was distinct from intelligence.
So that's a really important point in this whole debate, right? About whether creativity is its own thing or if it's just part of general intelligence.
Right, yeah, exactly. It's been an ongoing discussion for a long time.
The paper also mentions that Wallach and Kogan, there haven't been as many studies on their validity
Yeah, we just don't have as much data on how well they actually measure creativity.
compared to the TTCT.
Right.
Okay, so now what about the Guilford battery? I feel like I've heard that name before.
Yeah, the Guilford battery, it comes from Guilford's structure of intellect model, which is a pretty big theory. It's a set of 10 tests.
Whoa, 10. That's a lot.
I know, right? And they're designed to tap into different aspects of divergent production, which includes semantic or meaning-based and figural or visual stuff.
Okay.
And the paper actually gives some examples of those test names, like names for stories and what to do with it.
Those are interesting names.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so what else is unique about the Guilford battery?
Well, unlike Wallach and Kogan, Guilford actually does have time limits for each test. And the scores usually focus on fluency and originality. And it's interesting, the Guilford tests, they tend to have a higher correlation with IQ scores than Wallach and Kogan.
Oh, so that brings us back to that whole intelligence connection again.
Yeah. Now, there's a lot of research supporting Guilford's overall theory, the structure of intellect. But the paper points out that the research specifically on this creativity battery isn't as extensive as, say, the TTCT. So more to learn there for sure.
Okay, so different assumptions baked into these different tests and different levels of, research behind them.
Right. Okay, now, this one sounds kind of different. What about the Purdue Elementary Problem-Solving Inventory? It's multiple choice.
Yeah, that's a different approach.
Okay.
It's multiple choice. There are right and wrong answers.
Okay.
And it's trying to measure these specific problem-solving skills that are important for creative problem-solving. So things like recognizing when there even is a problem,
Right.
defining the problem clearly, asking the right questions, generating possible causes and consequences, coming up with unusual uses for objects, paying attention to detail, really looking at those nitty-gritty problem-solving steps.
So it's less about generating a bunch of different ideas and more about evaluating how well you can think through a problem in a structured way.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And they try to use more real-life situations. They show the test takers black and white slides of people and scenes.
Oh, interesting.
Which, they were trying to make it feel more relevant to real-world problems.
Right. Because sometimes those creativity tests, they feel very abstract. Exactly. And it's also a time test. They use a tape recording for the instructions.
Yeah.
So everyone gets them the same way.
Oh, okay. So controlled for consistency.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. And the paper also briefly mentions Flanagan's ingenuity test and Mednick's remote associates test.
Yeah, so Flanagan's ingenuity test, it basically presents these problem situations, kind of work-related, but the paper does mention they might be a bit dated now.
Okay.
And the test takers, they have to complete an idea where they're given the first and last letters of the missing word or phrase.
Oh, so it's like a word puzzle,
Kind of.
but with a purpose.
Yeah, it's a blend of convergent thinking, finding the specific word, and divergent thinking, because it has to be relevant and novel. And then you've got Mednick's remote associates test. That one gives you 3 words that seem completely unrelated.
Okay.
And you have to come up with a 4th word that's linked to all 3.
Oh, that's a tough one. I can see that being tricky.
Yeah, and this is based on the idea that creative people have a wider network of associations in their minds.
Okay, so Flanagan's is more about completing a specific idea within a real-world context, whereas Mednick's is about finding that unique connection between seemingly very different things.
Exactly.
Okay, got it. And then there's this one that kind of moves beyond just visual and written tests, right?
Yeah, the thinking creatively with sounds and words test.
Right, that one uses sound.
It uses auditory stimuli,
Okay.
like unusual words, complex sounds, as a jumping-off point for ideas.
Oh, that's really cool. That's a very different way to try to tap into creativity. It's not visual, it's not written, it's...
Right, it's through a different sensory channel.
Okay.
And it lines up with Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, acknowledging that creativity isn't just expressed through words or pictures.
Oh, right.
And this test specifically focuses on divergent thinking, but in the auditory domain,
Yeah.
which isn't explored as much as visual and verbal creativity.
Okay, that makes sense. And then the paper also talks about self-report inventories, like where people are asked to assess their own creative tendencies, right?
Right, yeah. Instruments like something about myself or Sam
Okay.
and what kind of person are you? They call that WKOP,
Okay.
developed by Catena and Torrance.
Mm-hmm.
And these ask people to reflect on their activities and personality traits, those things that are often linked to creativity.
Okay.
And then you've got things like Goff's adjective checklist, which includes a whole creativity scale made up of adjectives that seem to correlate with creative individuals.
Oh, interesting.
There are also scales for teachers to rate children's creative behaviors in the classroom. Renzulli and Hartman, they have one. It looks at traits like curiosity, fluency of ideas, that willingness to take risks.
Okay, so these tools are shifting the focus away from just performance on tasks and more towards like people's own perceptions of themselves and how they behave.
Right. It's that subjective experience. How do you see yourself
Exactly.
and how do others see you?
Right. Okay, and then the paper gets into personality, preference, or style inventories.
Yeah, so those. The Baron Welsh art scale, for example. It looks at people's preference for complex and asymmetrical drawings, as opposed to simple and symmetrical ones.
Okay.
And the idea is that creative people are more comfortable with complexity, more drawn to those intricate patterns.
Right. Like maybe they just find those more interesting or stimulating.
Yeah. Then you've got the Myers-Briggs type indicator, the MBTI.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that one.
Right. That assesses how people prefer to gather information and make decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And some patterns have been linked to more innovative thinking.
Okay.
But the paper does note that the validity of its 16 different types has been questioned in more recent research.
So like even these popular tools sometimes are still being debated and refined.
Right, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah.
It shows that the field's evolving.
It's healthy to question these things, right?
Exactly.
So then there are other inventories, like Bassador's Creative Problem-Solving Profile Inventory, which helps identify different creative problem-solving styles.
Right, like are you a generator,
Yeah.
a conceptualizer,
Mm.
an optimizer, an implementer?
Yeah.
Different ways of approaching creative problems.
Okay, I see.
And then Kierton's Adaption Innovation Inventory looks at whether someone's more of an adapter, working within existing frameworks, or an innovator, creating those new frameworks.
Oh, that's a really interesting distinction. Like in a team setting, that could be really useful to know who's more comfortable adapting, who's more likely to want to break the mold.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Understanding those different approaches can be so valuable.
Yeah. And then finally, there's the Higher Information Processing Survey.
Right. That one looks at whether someone leans more towards left brain or right brain processing.
Oh, okay.
So left hemisphere is often linked to verbal, sequential stuff. Right hemisphere that's more spatial, intuitive.
Hmm.
And the researchers behind this one, they say that an integrated style, using both effectively, is the best predictor of creative ability.
So it's not that one is better than the other, it's about having that flexibility.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so now the paper moves on to talking about instruments that are specifically designed for younger children.
Right, because those traditional pencil and paper tests might not be the best way to measure creativity in kids.
Right.
So Torrance himself, he developed thinking creatively and action and movement,
Oh, okay.
which uses more physical tasks to bring out creative responses.
Oh, I see. So
Yeah.
getting them moving and doing things.
Right. And then Starkweather has a procedure for preschoolers, uses puzzles, drawing, everyday tasks to look at things like conformity, willingness to try new things, curiosity, originality.
Okay.
And then there are even playfulness scales, like Lieberman's and Russ's. Those focus on observing kids during play and looking for indicators of creativity.
Right, so it's about observing them in a more natural setting.
Right, because play is so important for how kids learn and develop.
Absolutely. And finally, the paper discusses environmental indexes.
Yeah, these are all about measuring the environment and how that influences creativity.
Right.
So there's the Classroom Activities Questionnaire, or CAQ,
Okay.
based on Bloom's taxonomy.
Mhm.
You know, it looks at what kinds of thinking the classroom activities emphasize, the overall focus, the climate of the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And research has shown that when classrooms have a more supportive climate and focus on higher level thinking, the students tend to score higher on creativity tests.
So it's not just about the individual student. The environment really matters.
It really does.
Okay. And then there's the Classroom Climate Observation Schedule, or CCOS.
Yeah, the CCOS. It's where trained observers actually go into the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
They're watching for specific behaviors, the motivational climate, how much uniqueness is encouraged, that balance of divergent and convergent thinking, how much the students take initiative, what the relationships are like.
So it's a much more detailed look at what's actually happening in the classroom.
Right. But it requires more training to make sure the observations are reliable.
Right. To make sure everyone's looking for the same things. Okay, so it's really clear that trying to assess creativity is this huge, multifaceted effort. You're looking at the person, what they produce, how they do it, and the environment they're in. It's a lot.
Yeah, it's a couple. And then the paper kind of shifts gears a bit. It starts talking about these big forces of change that have been influencing how we think about and assess creativity.
Right.
And they identify 3 key areas: advances in learning theory, changes in creativity theory itself, and big changes in education as a whole.
Okay, so those are big overarching forces.
Yeah.
So let's start with learning theory. The paper talks about a shift from behavioral theories to cognitive theories. How has that impacted creativity assessment?
Well, I think that move towards cognitive theories, which emphasize the active and constructive nature of thinking. That's been huge for education and for creativity assessment, too. We've moved away from just looking at observable behaviors and started trying to understand those mental processes that drive creative thought.
Okay, so it's going deeper than just, what did you do?
Right. And it aligns so well with those process-oriented approaches that creativity researchers have been pushing for. Now there's more focus on active learning, the learner's initiative, self-regulation, and using more authentic assessments like portfolios that capture that whole learning journey, not just the final product.
Right. And in a way, creativity researchers were kind of ahead of their time in recognizing the importance of this kind of active process-oriented learning.
Yeah, definitely. They were pioneers in a lot of ways.
So instead of just measuring the final creative output, now we're also interested in fostering the thinking skills and processes that lead to that output.
Exactly. We want to nurture those creative minds. And modern motivation theories, too, they emphasize intrinsic motivation. That drive that comes from within, from being genuinely interested and enjoying the task itself. That has big implications for how we design learning and assessment, how we encourage that intrinsic spark.
Right. If you're intrinsically motivated, you're much more likely to be creative.
Right. Absolutely.
Okay, so that makes sense. Now, what about changes in creativity theory itself?
Yeah. So how we understand creativity, how we define it.
Right, because that's evolving too, right?
Right. How has that impacted assessment?
Well, I think there's been this growing awareness that we need stronger theoretical frameworks to guide how we assess creativity.
Okay.
We've moved away from those simpler views of creativity to more complex, systems-oriented models.
Okay.
Where before we might have focused on isolated traits or abilities, now we're seeing these newer models that really emphasize the interaction of lots of different things: personality, social influences, cognitive processes, the environment.
Right. It's this interplay of so many different factors.
Exactly.
So it's not this single trait anymore. It's more this emergent thing that arises from the interplay of many different elements.
It really is, yeah.
Yeah.
And that makes assessment even more complex, but it gives us a richer understanding of what we're trying to capture.
Right, right. Okay, so that's learning theory and creativity theory. And then the third big force of change is in education itself. Yeah, so education. There have been some major shifts happening.
What have you noticed there?
Well, there's been this big push for reform, right? Driven by this need for students to develop higher order thinking skills, critical thinking, problem solving, and being able to manage information effectively.
Right, because those are the skills you need to really thrive in the 21st century, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's led to more emphasis on active learning, engaging with complex problems, using technology, and this shift in the teacher's role. Teachers are becoming more like facilitators, mentors, resources for students, rather than just lecturers.
So those approaches that creativity researchers have been talking about for a while, like student-centered learning, they're becoming more mainstream.
Exactly. They're at the forefront now.
Okay.
But that means we need to rethink how we assess learning in general, and definitely creativity. There's this recognition that educators need more training and assessment to be able to support these changes in education.
It's about equipping them with the tools and knowledge they need.
Right, for sure.
Okay, so it seems like everything's kind of coming together towards this more comprehensive perspective on creativity. So given all these changes, what guidelines do the authors suggest for the future of creativity assessment?
Well, they really advocate for a big shift away from just focusing on the creative product as the be-all and end-all. It's more about understanding and assessing the creative process itself.
Right, so not just what did you create, but how did you get there?
Exactly. They highlight the constructivist view that the mind is always creating, building meaning, and understanding. And they give 4 guiding principles for assessment. First, tests are just little snippets of behavior, so use a variety of approaches. Second, you can't perfectly predict real-world creative achievement from test scores alone. Look for evidence of actual accomplishments. Third, people are different, so different assessments might be more suitable for different individuals.
Right. One size doesn't fit all.
And fourth, they really emphasize using measurement as a tool to help people learn and develop.
Oh, so assessment can be used to actually enhance creativity.
That's the goal. Yeah. It's not just about putting a label on someone, it's about helping them grow.
Okay, and the paper then breaks down its recommendations based on the different goals of assessment, like identifying gifted students, or fostering learning and development, or research and program evaluation.
Yeah, so for identifying gifted students, or really any kind of categorization, they really stress using lots of different sources of data, not just one standardized test.
Okay, so a more holistic approach.
Yeah. Nominations from teachers, peers, assessments that use different senses, expert judgments of student work, any other